Everyone, welcome. I'm very thrilled that you are all here for what is sure to be a wild chat about climate change and wildlife conservation. As a refresher on our Zoom rules of play, please keep yourself on mute so that we can absorb every brilliant word that comes out of our esteemed panelists' mouths. You can type questions as they come up, comments, quandaries, quagmires, concerns into the Zoom chat box, which I'm sure you have all done before, and we will address them either as they come up or in the last few minutes of our time together when we're having our question and answer session. So I am going to kick us off with a few thoughts. I am a lifelong animal lover, mother to a dog and a rabbit, and a foster mom, former bear biologist, wildlife rehabilitator. I'm primarily interested in how climate change affects different animal species. I used to host a podcast about bear behavior and how to avoid human-wildlife conflict, another fun fact. So a lot of my time was thinking about, while I acknowledge that human growth and development can create some tense, sticky interspecies conflicts and situations, and I've seen that happen myself, I do actually fully believe that a healthy functioning ecosystem can support us all, humans and wildlife alike. I think it's realistic, and I'm about to introduce you all to people that make me believe that this is possible. So our first panelist is Hawkins-Hilke. He works for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department as a conservation planning biologist. And in this role, he helps towns, regional planning commissions, and NGOs with their conservation planning efforts. This includes helping with GIS, natural resource mapping, advice on prioritizing significant natural features, and implementing town conservation goals. He did his undergraduate work at Connecticut College in environmental sociology and has a master's in botany from the University of Vermont. Zoe, there's a connection there, as a field naturalist. So welcome, Jens.
Thanks, great to be with you all tonight.
Excellent. Our next panelist is Sarah Chirichigno. Sarah has a bachelor's degree in psychology and political science from the University of Michigan. She worked in Washington, D.C. for the Natural Resources Defense Council, the NRDC, on their international climate team for 3 years while she was at Hopkins getting her master's degree in environmental science and policy. Go Blue Jays. Sarah knew that environmental science was her passion and felt a calling to work directly with youth, which really excites us at KCI. She left NRDC and earned yet another master's degree in secondary science education from the University of Michigan. And she moved to Salt Lake City in 2019, where she teaches AP Environmental Science and Earth Science. So thank you for joining us, Sarah. Moving on, we have Luke Roberson, who is the Adopt a Wetland Coordinator for University of Georgia Maine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant. He is originally from Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and has undergraduate degrees in both graphic design and biology from the University of Kentucky. He also has a master's in environmental science and policy from, you guessed it, Johns Hopkins. Luke has worked with many federal and state agencies, as well as nonprofits and universities, and he currently lives in Savannah, Georgia, with his wife and 2 adorable sons. And now for our final panelist, Zoe Rosen. She is a recent graduate of the University of Vermont, where she studied wildlife biology and forestry. And if I remember correctly, did some pretty cool field and research work while she was there. Zoe has a strong passion for conservation biology and sanctuary work, as well as animal welfare and behavior. I used to work at the Humane Society with Zoe, and I can tell you she's a rock star of her generation, and I so look forward to everything that you're going to accomplish. So now that we all know a few things about our panelists, why don't we get into it? The way that we will structure this is I will ask our panelists questions about climate change and wildlife conservation, and I'll give each of you, I'll call on you to give you a chance to answer the question. Since we're not in person, you won't really be able to cue off of one another, so I'll call you out, you can answer, or you can just take a hard pass, and I'll just take that opportunity to blab on about something. So our first question, how does climate change affect wildlife? Can you give us the most poignant example of how climate change is affecting specific species that you have worked with or have thought about or want to work with in the future? And for those who are not directly working with animals or in the field, you could also tell us, a climate change issue that affects a particular species that you enjoy or have studied or worked with in the past. So let's start with Jens.
I guess the first point that I want to make is that climate change is making all of our other problems worse. And so as we think about things like forest fragmentation, that's long been a problem in the Northeast, our big forest blocks getting smaller and smaller, cut up by roads. Well, so that has impacts on wildlife. But the consequences for wildlife of that fragmentation are even worse in the face of climate change, because species have to adjust their range in the face of this change in climate. So the Nature Conservancy estimates that entire populations are moving north and south away from the equator, on average about 11 kilometers per decade, or about a mile per year. That's not a straight north and south movement in the Northeast. That's east-west and north-south. But that's necessary to maintain those ranges, to maintain genetic heterogeneity among populations. Anyway, my point is, climate change is making our problems worse. The bear are not going to sweat to death. The bear are going to get hit crossing the road as they respond to climate change. So climate change is making our problems worse, and forest fragmentation is the first one I want to talk about, because it really is affecting all of our species here in Vermont and across the Northeast. So that's my first little tidbit, and I welcome to hear from others about more specific species interactions.
Yeah, shall we turn it over to Zoe?
Yeah, so actually going off of that, something that I really kind of resonated with when I was in school, going along with forest fragmentation, but a little bit more specific, huge problem in the Northeast is with moose and in winter tick infestations. This is definitely a more specific example, but winter ticks in the winter aren't dying off. So moose aren't getting that kind of break that they used to. They also, compared to deer are able to feel when a tick lands on them and they can kind of shake it off. Moose do not. They only feel it once the tick is kind of already embedded in them. And then from there, it's just, they can't really do anything about it. And then it kind of moves into a painful, slow death for them by tick infestation. And that has been a huge issue that they've been seeing a lot of in Vermont and in the Northeast in general.
Wow, I just learned a lot about moose and ticks. Zoe, what about you, Sarah?
Well, I would like to say that my school mascot is the moose. So I'm particularly, and I've seen moose in the wild out here in Utah. So it's really beautiful. But one of the issues that we're really facing out west, and of course you're all very aware of it, the drought is very, very severe out here. And kind of going along with what Zoe is saying, one of the particular issues that we're dealing with is bark beetles. And again, climate change plays a huge role in that. They're not dying off in the winter. They're sometimes even getting the ability to reproduce more than once per year. And these can just take out massive swaths of forest, kill the trees. And we're having all these forest fires. We've got all these dead trees just kind of waiting to be burnt, which has an impact on countless species, right? We're looking at so much development. I live in the Salt Lake Valley, and the development here is through the roof. And so when you talk about forest fragmentation and increasing the amount of edge effect, right, on the edge of all those forests where you've got humans and animals just very closely cohabitating, and that's not the way it was necessarily meant to be. So we've got kind of both those issues that you guys were kind of hitting at out here and out west. Mm-hmm.
What you got, Luke?
So I think I'm pretty certain that I'm the most southern based biologist here. So our bears are actually more like alligators here, I guess would be the good transition. So one of the things we come across here in the coast is we have a lot of sea level rise. Is one of the biggest things we encounter here on our coast. I know my house is at a whopping 13 feet of elevation, so it's something that we have to deal with quite often. But Savannah is also the second largest port on the East Coast, so we get a lot of big ships coming in and out. And in order to incorporate a lot of those ships, we've done a lot of dredging up the Savannah River. And so that's allowed this like big piston of salt water to come farther and farther inland. And so we've seen a lot more saltwater intrusion into a lot of areas that didn't used to get that, especially just up the river lies the Savannah National Wildlife Refuge, which is home to countless birds and lots of alligator habitats, mostly it's supposed to be freshwater, but they're seeing a lot more inundation and they're having to do a lot more work with like dikes and pumps to try to keep out that salt water from harming the habitat there. And a lot of habitats are changing from like freshwater marsh to saltwater marsh, and we're seeing that kind of encroachment as sea levels rise. So yeah, it's something that we deal with every day, and we're seeing the changes. You can, especially people who've been there for years, you can see the changes happen. I mean, it seems like they're accelerating every day.
That's very true and very worrisome. I find that a lot of the conversations that I have around climate change, at least very recently, have been just so negative and stressful. So it can leave people with a sense of helplessness that we just want to avoid, because that's when people start sticking their head in the sand and not caring anymore. So given how that whole global conversation is going, why should our future leaders, the high school and college age generation, youth of today, as well as their families, communities, why should we care about what happens to wildlife? Like, what does wildlife have to do with us? Do we want to go in the same order as before?
Sure. Well, I think there are a variety of reasons, and I'll just put it in terms of self-interest. In Vermont, I do community values mapping a lot. I ask people what they care about most. And the type of responses we get back overwhelmingly, and this is really across the political spectrum, is this love of place and this celebration of rural character and celebration of living close to the land, and that connection. And it really doesn't, that cuts across politics, is that connection to the land, that love of place. And wildlife is a huge part of that. And climate change is really threatening that connection to our place, because we're having a hard time recognizing our place. I'm sure the people in Portland who are experiencing 116-degree weather for the first time ever are thinking, where is this place? This isn't the Portland that I love. Heck, we're experiencing 86 degrees, and I feel like that's a little too warm for me. So our tradition, our relationships to these to our places are getting fundamentally changed, and wildlife and our connection to wildlife is really central to that. So I'd say that's a huge reason why we should care, is because we love our places and we want them to remain the way they are. We want our children to experience what we're experiencing, and so that's my first thought.
That's so true. And just to piggyback off of that, I had read a study somewhere, it was about a year ago, that interviewed subjects and asked how they valued certain places that they would visit or live in. And the places that had their species intact, like megafauna or any other type of exotic or exciting species like bears, for example, I think that's the one that they used, was always valued higher by people than the places that bears didn't exist. Even if they had never even seen bears there, if they know they're around, they value it more. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I feel like I even kind of experienced that just you know, going places. I remember I had a field course in Vermont where we go up to the Northeast Kingdom, and my professor told me every year we see a moose. So like, don't worry, I'll guarantee it. And my year was the first year that they didn't see one, you know, so I totally, you know, am experiencing that and agree with that as well. Pivoting a little bit, I think that the intersection of climate change and wildlife and how it impacts our food is really interesting. For example, the most cliche example, bees and pollinators. Bees pollinate like $200 billion worth of food annually. And that is something that I think people forget about. You know, the bee crisis has been going on for a while and they're developing ways to fix it, but there's also different species that do different things. And so it's really important to just keep that biodiversity. Yeah, and then just in terms of human encroachment on habitat and more, like you were saying, Kristina, more human wildlife interactions, that isn't always necessarily a good thing. You know, that could be dangerous. First of all, it could lead to more zoonotic diseases and stuff like that. So that's my take.
Well, I will go full AP environmental science teacher on you because we talk a lot about ecosystem services in my class, and the four primary categories, and I've got mine pulled up on my screen so I don't forget one. So provisioning services, these are the goods that we receive from the environment, and that one of the things you're talking about, food, right? But also timber, for example, that's a good that we receive from the environment that we do need. The second would be regulating services, and that's when you get into pollination, purification of water, carbon sequestration, waste decomposition. These are all different regulating services. Support services, this is the one that my students always kind of, it's more vague, but like nutrient cycling, the formation of soil. These support services may be things that they're not as direct. They're a lot more indirect and a lot more abstract. And then finally, the last one that Kristina was kind of getting at would be the cultural services. So knowing that it exists, like knowing that there are black bears out there, even though I don't live there, I value that they exist. And that's that cultural service, right? And that also includes spiritual and historical. So indigenous peoples, their lands, they have very spiritual values to them. So those are the four ecosystem services that we talk about quite a bit in my AP environmental science classes. And I always remind students, this is why you need to care about the environment, because these are all of the things that nature provides for you.
Yeah, Sarah, you really summed up a lot of what I was going to say too as well. I mean, we have here in the Georgia coast, we have a very big affinity for our wetlands because they do act as so many functions that are essential for living here. You know, they're buffers for all the hurricanes that we keep getting more and more of. They provide habitat for shellfish, birds, fish, tons of recreation, and a lot of the economy that's generated on the Georgia coast. And of course, you're talking about the cultural benefits and everything. And there's the Gullah Geechee community was up and down the Georgia and South Carolina coast. They're the descendants of enslaved people who have this very intense connection with the landscape of the wetlands and the Georgia coast. And those kind of values, you try to incorporate those into your lessons and things like that when you're talking to people. Because I mean, when we often talk about when you're interacting with the public or anything like that, you might not get those people to be, they're not going to drop everything they're doing and become ecologists or anything like that, but they might join a riverkeeper, or they might join another group that's doing good in the community. Do a cleanup, and you're trying to incorporate that value and respect for the culture and the wildlife and things that make, as Jan said earlier, like this place-based value system. And that's the kind of work that I've tried to incorporate into a lot of my stuff that I do.
Thank you. So is there anything to keep us on the solution side, on the positive side? Is there anything that you've worked on or that you've seen that you find really interesting, or you wish that somebody would come up with as far as solutions, be they small scale, medium scale, large scale? to mitigate climate change's effects on wildlife?
I'll jump in. You know, a lot of my work is with communities, and in the face of climate change, it remains true that where we put development and where we don't put development is one of the most important things for wildlife. And so, as I said earlier, you know, the ramifications, the effects from climate change make those decisions even more intense. When we screw up, when we put houses in the floodplain, we feel those effects. So in terms of solutions, by being more careful about where we're putting development, by giving that more scrutiny, I think we're beginning to make change in the face of climate change. Now, Vermont is a very different beast than other places in the world. We're not building new roads, for example. We're just not. We're maintaining our aging infrastructure as best we can. And we don't see a lot of, 200 lot subdivisions. I hear that. We're different. But we do see a one house at a time sort of development pattern. Where we get this constant drip of ex-urban sprawl. And so for solutions, what I'm seeing is people continue to get involved. In my world, I work with volunteers. It's volunteers in Vermont that are on the planning commissions. They're on the conservation commissions. Those volunteers have incredible amounts of power. Now, I hope you've heard this before, but the world is planned, the world is run by those who show up. And we're lucky to still have some people showing up that are making these, that are raising these points and saying, hey, how much development should we be allowing in our floodplains? Isn't that a bad idea? What about high elevation development? Should we be allowing that? No, I don't think so. So I think the most important solution, I'm seeing this and I want to encourage more of it, is show up. Related to that, I just want to talk about, volunteerism. Because who's been showing up for these last 30 years? It's the baby boomers. It's my parents' generation. Those are the people who show up to these meetings where ultimately climate policy gets decided. And so it's an older demographic. It's often women, older women. That's awesome. They've been carrying our weight for a long, long time. Who's going to replace that cohort of volunteers? Well, I'm looking at you all on this webinar and saying, we all have to stand up. People of my generation, we're still going to PTO meetings. I'm chasing an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old boy. I'm just hoping they don't shoot each other with arrows while I'm gone. I got a lot going on, but we still need that volunteerism, and I'm hoping all of us can step up even more in that regard.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of that, and kind of going off of that, and something that kind of pertains to my generation and generations after me is voting. For so long we were, recycle, like tell your friends, but the real change comes with voting. And like you said, there are so many projects, so many initiatives going on, but the real change can't happen unless it's at that kind of greater level, especially federal funding and stuff like that. State funding is super important for projects like that. And that just can't happen if we don't have the right leaders in place. And I think that's something my generation and generations after me are kind of slowly, kind of catching on to, especially with the past 2 elections. It was incredibly important. So yeah, just kind of that overarching being involved and staying involved.
Yeah, Zoe, I so agree with you. And that's really why I personally left my desk job in DC, was because I felt all of the power was just with the younger generations, right? Like that is the future. They're future leaders. And so that's where we have to sink our time and energy. One thing that has amazed me, blown me away, and mind you, I was 27 when I started teaching. I'm now 29. And I was floored by, and I should have known this, how connected the students are through social media. It astounds me. I have a teacher Instagram account, and I have students DMing me all the time. They're like, "Hey, Mrs. Chirichigno, did you see this?" And they'll send you some Instagram reel or a TikTok that shows some invention in some other country, sometimes here, but most of the time in Europe. And they'll say, "Did you see this? This is really, really cool." And I'm like, yes. And I feel like that is, for me, so motivating to see 14-year-olds using their free time to go on the internet and find this stuff and DM it to their teacher. Like, what? I love these kids. And they give me so much hope and motivation. And teaching this year was really, really difficult, but they made it, so worth it. And they continue to do so. So I think, keep working with youth through their methodology. Like, we know that, these kids, I call them the Zoomers, Generation Z, Zoomers, or I call them Generation iPad, whatever you want to call them. I love them and adore them, and I have so much hope in them. But their means and mediums of learning is different than maybe ours. They don't have Facebook. They don't. Then they might not ever have Facebook. So how are we going to reach these kids in a different way and meet them where they're at, and interest them and draw them in? Because that's how we do it. I really feel. And I also think, speaking as a teacher, really working these environmental standards into national curricula. Like, this has to be something that's being taught at every single high school. Sustainability needs to be something that every student graduates high school and they can explain to you what sustainability means and ways that they can help achieve it in their personal life. So that's how I feel. And one more thing I just want to say, something you said, something that we wish someone would come up with in terms of solutions. One thing that has disheartened me in the last year was our huge resurgence to single-use plastic. And I know that's because COVID, right, really, really changed things. And we've become much more cognizant of airborne viruses. Obviously, that's a good thing, to be careful and cautious. We don't want to spread it. But it is really disheartening to me to go to the grocery store and see things that used to, be available are now just like wrapped in just layers and layers and layers of plastic. And I don't have a solution for that right now, because I see both sides of the issue. On one hand, I'm like, yeah, of course we don't want to spread germs. And on the other hand, I'm like, dang, every single person's walking out of here with a whole lot of plastic, more than they used to a year and a half ago. So in terms of solutions that I'm looking for, that's a big one.
Yeah, to go on stuff, what people said earlier about volunteering and things like that. That's one of the things that I work with a lot as Adopt the Wetland Coordinator. And COVID has really put a dent in a lot of volunteering. People are very, very scared to come out for quite a while. Just now starting to open up. So and people are kind of starving to do these things. People are really wanting to get together and do these kind of things. But as you're right about, a lot of the volunteers are people who have the time and money to do those kind of things. And I think that's a problem a lot with citizen science, that it really kind of hits those folks a lot of times, and we're missing out on a lot of people who would be really open to this kind of thing if we provided the solutions for them, made it more accessible. So it's some of the things we've worked on is like providing training in different languages for different underserved communities. Not just doing stuff, doing your trainings and things like that here, but making them virtual so people can get to them wherever they might be, or going to them was really like, that's when I've had the best success, is going out to, underserved schools and, going to after school programs and making it accessible as possible to get more of those folks in. And really you can bring it home for them, because we can start talking about environmental justice issues and things like that. It's kind of like everyday occurrences they see, and when they can start making those connections, you bring them into the fold, and then they get that, as we said earlier, like that respect and value, and they'll take that on, and they become that generation that Sarah's talking about, that really makes those big changes, and you kind of build that kind of volunteer core up. And I'm really heartened when I see we now that we're starting to open up a bit, and we're doing like summer camps at my work. I work at the the Marine Education Center Aquarium here through UGA, and it's so awesome to find kids back at the aquarium doing, you know, camps and stuff like that, and school groups coming in. And man, it's just, it really, your heart gets big when you start seeing these people, and you know, they see a horseshoe crab or something like that for the first time, their eyes get like dinner plates, and it's just awesome to see that again. So those are things that I've seen. And one of the things I've really liked to push in my research also is like research that leads towards, you know, better policy in the future. You know, if you're doing water quality testing, you try to make it so it's easier for example, one of the things we're trying to work on is quicker and more informative water quality testing on our beaches. So if we have high bacteria counts and things like that, normally it's taken once a week, and it takes 24 hours to get results back. But we're working with a new qPCR, which is kind of what the same kind of things you use to get a COVID test with, this PCR technology. We can use it, and now you get results in like 2 to 4 hours, and you know a lot more information about it. So it's those kind of products that make policy easier, and people start to see concrete results out of that. Those are things that make me feel better about the kind of the direction we're headed in these kind of things.
If I may, Luke, I just want to jump off on that. And, you know, if there's any doubt as to whether education can lead to culture change, I just want to offer one example. For the last 15 years, we've been doing a training for our Agency of Transportation called Highways and Habitats. And you know, early on, it was kind of fringe stuff. And for the folks at Agency of Transportation, it was really an excuse to get outside 6 times over the course of the year from their desk jobs. But we kept on hitting it in terms of, you know, why understanding road ecology, this interaction between wildlife and roads, was so important. And we helped the course. Excuse me, is open to anyone in our Agency of Transportation, from engineers to plow truck drivers to folks in the Attorney's General Office. And now that we've been running it so long, many of our earliest graduates have worked their way up into middle management of the Agency of Transportation. Conversations we used to have for building climate resilience into the agency used to not go so well when talking to higher level Agency of Transportation folks. And we notice such a remarkable difference now when we go and talk about a wildlife crossing structure or changing some specification to better fit for wildlife. The reception is a world of difference. And it took us a while to figure it out. And now we look around the room and we say, oh, that supervisor, he's a Highways and Habitats grad. That supervisor, yep, she took it as well. And we can look around the room for all of our former students, and there they are in places of leadership. And so, Luke, you're absolutely right. That education is critical for this culture change, and we're seeing it. So it's not just among the students or among folks of high school age, it's really education across the board. And one last thing I'll say is that education doesn't have to lead with the term climate change. Cassandra, I'm just seeing your message in the chat about, you know, climate change isn't selling very well in Colorado. You know, I often talk about just effects on wildlife from sprawl or resilience or flooding resilience, because it's affecting our economic bottom line. Or just talk about the love of forests and how if you love a forest and you love wildlife, you want to keep them intact, connected, and diverse. My point here is that we can talk about the same set of issues without mentioning the word climate change if we need to. I don't think that's a great idea all the time. I want to keep saying the word climate change. It's important that we put 2 and 2 together. But in some communities that I walk into where I know climate change is just, that word is going to shut people down, we can just talk about love of forest and we can get to those same issues. So anyway, just the tidbit to riff off what you were saying, Luke. Thanks.
You're absolutely right. And in areas, where I'm at, there are students who love fishing and hunting. Like, you can focus on it through that viewpoint. You don't have to. And I agree with you that it's important that we discuss, why this climate change, like, we have to acknowledge it. But I do think that you can focus on specific issues, like Luke said in the chat box, finding that common ground. And I have pretty much found time and time again that when I provide the data and I say, okay, here's the data set, go ahead and graph it, then analyze it. And it's really becomes very difficult to dispute it when they see it that way. And I have seen changed mindsets in students after evaluation of data.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I always think that one of the toughest things to learn is science communication in our field, and knowing how to talk to different people about this. Sometimes the same subject, you could talk about it way different way in different ways. So yeah, I've worked with federal agencies, state agencies, nonprofits, and lots of other different groups, and everybody can talk about the same thing in a totally different way. So if you can kind of, like, I think I put in the chat, kind of like you kind of code switch a little bit between, like, if I'm talking to a DNR guy, I'm talking about like bureaucracy, and I'm talking about the steps that they go think through their job. When I'm talking about folks who live on the river, I'm talking about, like, fishing and hunting, like Sarah talked about. But finding those shared values, that's when you really hit the good stuff, and you can really put those coalitions together to get a lot of work done.
Absolutely. And yeah, science communication is so important. I remember when I was in, I think, 6th grade, I first started hearing about string theory, and I was all twisted up about it. I was really confused. I didn't understand. I remember just watching one video. It was one video that made it totally understandable to the layperson. And from then I was like, oh, string theory. I got it. You're good. That's all it took to make me interested and understand. So I understand where you're coming from with that. All right. So I think we kind of covered, specific actions that people in the community can take to mitigate climate change and the effects on wildlife. I'm going to give the last couple of minutes to our attendees, to our audience, to see if they have any questions for our panelists.
Can I start us off? Is that okay?
Sure.
I know for myself, it's easy sometimes to get bogged down in feeling like the problem's too big. Like, I'm not powerful enough. I'm not educated enough. I don't have enough money or resources. And I was wondering if you guys have any advice as far as how people who maybe feel like me sometimes can hold on to hope and keep moving forward.
I would, one of the first things I would say is find your tribe. It's kind of find your people, and because you're not alone in feeling like that. A lot of people feel like that. I would say it's almost like a version of imposter syndrome, where you're like, who am I to stand up and do these things? Like, like, I don't know these things. But once you get together with a group and you find your people, like that volunteer group, like a nonprofit. It can be as simple as folks who get together and read books together, and they can like there's a lot, I know there's a lot of groups around here who read environmental books, or stuff like that, just where they're trying to learn together, and then they can then when they come bring together, then like, hey, maybe let's go do a cleanup, let's go volunteer for this. Then you once you find your tribe, I think you get more confidence. There's always strength in numbers, so I think it helps a lot. Being introverted sometimes, I'm like, maybe not, but yeah, I think that helps a lot to find your folks.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sarah. Did you want to answer Julia's question? I'm so sorry.
I was just gonna say, when I teach these issues, I always make sure that I have a dedicated part of my class period where we talk about potential solutions. And I think that it's really important when you're teaching this and talking about this to, of course, make very clear all the issues. They're endless, right? We've got a lot of environmental issues to address, but being really solutions oriented, I feel is really helpful. In Salt Lake Valley, we have really terrible air pollution, and we could hammer on about that. But we can also talk, why it's bad and why it's a problem, because that's important. But we can also talk about what are some steps and things we can do to mitigate this situation.
Thank you.
Caitlin, you had a question.
But I was not going to jump in. I was going to wait to be called on. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I work at KCI, and Julia and I are actually part of a little triad that is putting together a policy institute for college students. And, I think Sarah, but several of you touched on how crucial it is for youth to understand that there is personal action, but then there are actions that we need to take place at a state level or national level. For us putting together this policy institute, what are some key points or some crucial elements that we need to convey to our students?
I have two points. Well, the first is, the problem with individual responsibility is that the problems are really huge. And the more I often hear higher ups in government pull out the individual responsibility when they're refusing to actually take action. And so it's a great way of having our institutions sidestep action by saying, well, that's really about personal responsibility. So I'd say directly to you, Caitlin, is yes, personal responsibility is absolutely critically part of this, but it can't be an excuse for letting our leaders and our institutions off the hook. That's one. And then the other is, I had this recent sobering experience with COVID of analyzing my carbon footprint. I drive around, hopefully in the name of good, but I drive around a lot. And then come March of 2020, I stopped driving. And I continued to take a log for work of all of the meetings I did. And I used to attach all the meetings I did and how much I drove for that meeting. And now I was able to continue with my same log and figure out how many meetings I've done and zero driving. And it was so eye-opening to see just my own actions over the last year and a half and what a dramatic impact that's had. Literally hundreds of hours of my life I've gotten back because I didn't drive in the last year and a half. So what we're doing here, just meeting on Zoom, that is climate resilience. What we're doing right now is climate resilience in action. But I didn't want to get away from that, your point, Caitlin, of that idea of individual responsibility, but still not letting institutions off the hook.
And I also just kind of want to jump on that too with the carbon footprint in particular. And I just did a very quick Google search to fact check myself. But I believe per Google, the carbon footprint was actually developed and kind of pushed out by BP. So the idea that a large oil company would push out the idea of individual responsibility of like, what can you do to reduce the amount of blah, 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 when it's coming from a company that we know is doing so much environmental damage is pretty shocking. And I did just Google it, and I will drop the article in here into the chat box, but I do believe that to me is such a mind-blowing gaslighting scam that a gas and oil company could come up with an idea of taking individual responsibility.
Well, just to piggyback on that, that's one of the things we deal with when we talk about, every time we do a cleanup or anything like that, like look at all these bottles, like wouldn't it be great if Coke had something to do with it? And it's one of the things we had a couple of years ago was actually Coca-Cola came out to help us with a beach cleanup and like, hey, look at all these bottles you put out here. So great. So they're like, so they would like encourage their workers to come volunteer pick up trash, which seems like a really weird conflict. Like you're putting all these things out here, and now we get to pick up your trash. And it's a really, and they've done a lot to put that on the individual it's up to the individual to pick up those things, not up to the company who's making, you know, them by the millions. So yeah, it's a little bit disheartening, a little bit that that it's put on the individual when it would save a lot more energy, money to go the other way around.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, and again, kind of going back to what Julia was asking about, you know, you learn about all these issues, especially as like a STEM student. And then you feel the weight of the world on your back, especially, you know, being my age, I'm 22, I just graduated, you know, with an environmental degree. And now I feel like I have to do something monumental with it. But in reality, you're right. It's, you know, these companies that are putting, you know, this responsibility on us. And I think, again, going back to people, you know, in my generation and generations after me, I think people are really starting to catch on onto that gaslighting that large companies do, and starting to hold them accountable. So yeah, just totally agree with everything that was said. And I have hope for the future. I you know, feel like people are really kind of starting to see through the curtain and understanding how this is a systemic issue and not just, you know, your issue and the neighbor's issue, you know?
Yeah, that's really insightful, Zoe, and it makes me feel better to hear it from, you know, my target population, which is, you know, recent graduates, high school student age, high school college aged youth, to know that not everybody, yeah, you can feel really bogged down by it all, but there is definitely light at the end of the tunnel and things are happening. And it seems like there is sort of a cultural sea change that is very inspiring. So we are at time. So I think if that's all, we can wrap it up. Thank you everyone for attending the webinar. It was a delight to be able to see your faces. Thank you to all of our panelists, Luke, Zoe, Sarah, Jens. I'm a big fan, and I think you might have gotten some more fans tonight. So with that said, everyone be safe, be well, good night, and I hope that we will connect again very soon in the future.
Thanks, Kristina, for setting it up.
Thanks so much, Kristina.
Absolutely. You guys are the best.